often exploit those beneath them? Is it inherent in human nature, or is there something deeper at play? Welcome to the Thought Leader Way podcast, where I speak to thought leaders from across the world on various topics related to technology, business, human psychology, among other aspects. In today's episode, we will focus on the psychology of power. Why do humans exploit each other? I'm your host, Dr. Kartik Nagendraa, and today I'm thrilled to have my special guest, Tijana Mirovic. She holds a PhD in psychology from Stanford University and has spent over a decade researching the intricate dynamics of power and human behavior. So she will be sharing a lot of her research insights, drawing from real world examples, the psychological theories which may be around there, and the studies for us to understand why, as humans, we exploit and how do we actually break that cycle. So, welcome, Tiana. Really excited to have you with us here today.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here and to discuss this really challenging and interesting topic. Thank you.
Yes, I'm really curious. So, let's go to the origins of exploitation in itself. So, what does psychology tell us about the origin of exploitation? So, is it rooted in human nature, or is it a societal construct which drives that, or is it a combination of both?
That's an old psychological question, nurture versus nature. And You're right, it is the combination of both. And it's a very difficult thing to answer and to look at because it's not just nature and nurture. We now know with new research and ability to look into how human brain works that there is also something called epigenetics, which means that our experiences and our nurture can actually change the nature. And in this topic that we are addressing, I think it's interesting to mention one of the findings in many experiments that support this is that, like, if in one generation we experience hunger and starvation, our genes will adapt to this. We will have some genes suppressed, some expressed, but it's interesting that our offsprings in next generation, sometimes up to 2 or 3 generations ahead, will also have the same thing, which means that even talking about exploitation is difficult because we don't just talk about something that happened to us, but maybe also to something that happened in way before we were born. And I think one of the theories that we often use when we discuss this topic, it comes from evolutionary standpoint, saying that it's a matter of survival. This is the same reason why our genes would adapt, because, how similar our brain would think, if we can starve sometimes, then let's prepare for this. Let's survive the future starvation. But also there's talk about this social dominance theory that suggests that we have hierarchies and that we have this tendency to make one group or small group of people dominant and take power over the other ones, because this is a fight for resources. This is a fight for survival, sort of competition, because those who assert control historically have more resources in that sense. And that, the society makes it such that, if you look realistically, we have needs and we have enough in our environment basically to meet these needs. This is what we've seen throughout this history. But social constructs such as capitalism, let's say, they create additional needs. They make us think that wants are needs. They put people into competing into sort of a message that it's never good enough or that it's never enough. So we start to sort of fight for this, And I know that from this standpoint, people would say, but, this is not just a construct. People have always been doing this, the theories where we can just cooperate and be together and sort of function like this is a dream, but it's not, because you have a lot of in history also examples of this. I remember when I was in Australia, a tour guide told us a story how Aboriginals, when they first, quote unquote, sold the land, they were offered a couple of blankets and stuff. They gave it because they didn't have a concept of owning or selling the land. They lived there, they used the resources. This was completely new to them. And this is not the only example. And also, since I come from the field of trauma, our brain is not just wired for survival. It's also wired for connection. And sometimes connection is a survival. So other people and the relationship we have with them, and you see it also in the way that brain works, shows that there is definitely not just possibility, but the need to cooperate, to share, to be together. And we see this because we also see that in medical literature, in mental health literature, that if we are alone or isolated or separated from the surrounding, that also is something that is very detrimental. So I would say that we also have a lot to say about us being wired to be there for each other, to share, to be equal, to be free, and not to be exploited.
That's very interesting, right? So how we are wired, but how we actually behave with the kind
Yeah.
of examples which you gave, it's so different. So how does one actually acquire the power of influence, right? So there is always this moral decision making which is involved sometimes in what we do. And why do some people actually use power to uplift others while, some others may actually use it to exploit somebody else?
Yeah, we often say that power corrupts. And I think it was Abraham Lincoln who said that almost all men can stand adversity, but if you give them power, you will test their character, which implies what you just said, that some people use it, some people abuse it, some people use it to make other people dependent or abuse them. Some people make them to make the world a better place, and this really exists. But it does change us in some ways, and I will say a few words about that definitely. But I think it's also important to note that the power is not something that has always been there in terms of like ideas how to run the state, how the politics should be, what we should focus on. Like if you look at the writing from the classical time, like from Aristotle or Plato, they thought that politics and ethics are inseparable, and that we should structure society so that justice is realized, and that the good society is organized in such manner that the role of society is to enable good life of its citizens, to create environment in which they're happy, in which they reach this eudaimonia that he talked about. So for a long time, there was at least an idea or a mission that this should be achieved. And in some societies still has this. Good rulers know this. They want their people to be happy, and they want people to be equal, and they want them to use their own resources, knowledge, their own power to make a better society. But around the Renaissance, and this is name that is very important to understand the ruling, the views of power. We have Machiavelli, and his writings and teachings that it's not about justice, it's about power, and that politics should be, in a way, struggle for power in obtaining the most power you can, that this is what makes you a good ruler, and we still see this today. And in order to have more power, you're free basically to do whatever you want. You can lie, you can cheat, you can deceive. And we see now in many societies how this exists, and how these kind of people are seen in a positive lens, not in a negative, but like, oh, look, he's good, he knows how to handle himself, he's smart, and things like this. So that's something to think about. But to go back to your question, how does the power changes? What does the research say? One of the very interesting things I found, of course, is that it changes us in the area of empathy and moral awareness, exactly what you asked. And there's a very interesting study that shows that when people gain power, their ability to mirror emotions, which is a key mechanism in empathy, decreases. I think this was done by Keltner in 2016, I think. So they become less attuned to the emotions of others. And in that sense, they become less connected with the struggles of ordinary people. They cannot relate to this. The distance becomes bigger. And we all heard stories about Marie Antoinette and, let them eat cakes if they're hungry, if they cannot afford bread. And I don't know if that's true. There are some debates about it, but we witnessed here in where I come from, in Serbia, one of the politicians explaining on television, as a response to people saying prices are high, we have problems feeding our, he said, well, you can have one egg, it's I don't know how many calories, and it keeps you through the day. So, I think this is a good example of this. Of course, there's someone who is in power and very rich and doesn't respond to that. And one other theory that I found very interesting, and I saw it because I worked a lot in war-affected population, is of Bandura. He taught us a lot about learning and how we learn different sorts of behavior. I'm sure we'll mention him more today. He said that for people in power, we often see something what he called moral disengagement, which we need so that we can rationalize the harmful behavior. And some of the examples that he used is the euphemistic labeling, like in the business world, we will not say we're firing workers, we'll say we're downsizing. It sounds a little bit better, it sounds a little bit less threatening. or, we diffuse the responsibility, but I was following orders, but, everybody thinks like this, but, so and so told me this. And of course, what we see a lot is dehumanization. We see these people as less of a being and less important. We despise them or see them as less because they're poor, or because they're women, or because they're gay, or because, they're not members of our group. So, we use all of this mechanism to justify that we can use power in that sense, to hurt others, not just to uplift them. On the other hand, what research shows is that people with a strong moral identity, when they come to power, this moral will guide them into caring for others as well, and will stop them for abusing the power that they got. And we have examples of that too, luckily.
Okay. So those were some very interesting theories and real life examples that you spoke about, the moral compass and how some people used to uplift people and some used to actually exploit others. Do you see culture also playing a part in this? So are there any cultural or historical differences in how exploitation actually manifests, right? So like, are there any societal factors that make exploitation more prevalent in certain environments vis-a-vis in other environments?
Definitely, because if we look from a systemic point of view, it's not individual. We also have family, then we have, the inner surrounding, but we also have something at the level of culture or society and international level also. So all of these levels give factors that influence what we are talking about. Some of the things that we have seen in history and in today, and some of the things that also the theory has supported, is that societies with rigid hierarchies and are the ones that are going to more often justify and normalize exploitation, and people adopt it because they're born into it, like the caste system in India and in some other places,
Yes.
right from where you're born, you're taught this is it,
Yes.
this is where you
Yes.
belong, this is your level, this is it. And then we accept it and we don't
Yes.
change it so much. In contrary to that, where there is a less of a power difference, like in Scandinavian countries, the exploitation is not seen so much. Also, one thing that we saw is if there is a history of instability, of some sort of economical problems, like it was in the Balkans where I come from, we had wars, we had sanctions, we had all of these things, then you will see more that people justifies it because, the history of past trauma, sometimes again, something not that you personally lived through, but maybe your parents, but you were raised by them, by people who might be afraid to speak up their mind, when there's like, I don't know, political imprisonment, people would whisper, so they would say, and here we hear this a lot, come on, calm down, don't shake the boat, it will get worse, it will get, have. So these are some of the things that we see also. We also that, this value system is very important. Sometimes this is the social construct, we say that it's normal, like slavery is normal or fascism is normal because, again, we go back to these are lesser people. They have, they're not as built as we are. They're not as strong as we are, or, they're female. So therefore they don't have the right to vote, and we accept this, like it's the norm, like it's the most normal people in the world. We don't question it, where actually it's not the norm. It's just, something that we are taught of using, And speaking of economic crisis and stuff, we also, as humans, this is what Fromm, another important name in psychology, used to talk a lot about. We sometimes have problem taking on responsibility. Like this is difficulty with power. When you have power, you have a lot of responsibilities. So a lot of the people give that power away because it's easier than to be wrong or than to be. And in this way, they also give their freedom. And this especially tends to be heightened in times of crisis because then decision making is much more difficult. So in times like this, people would go often more to the dictatorship than to democratic processes, as we can also see. So I would say that
I agree with you. Yeah, I agree with you. The Indian context that you spoke about also. And many times it's also surprising how it is interpreted differently than what it was intended to be. So just to go back to the Indian context that you spoke about, and we have four classes that's been defined in the holy book of the Hindus that we have, which is the Gita. And those four sects were predominantly basis the occupation the individual was involved in. And it had nothing to do with whether one sect was superior or the other sect was inferior. But over the periods, with people in power I've misinterpreted that entire thing, and then it has emerged into this entire caste system and how people at the lowest level are ill-treated or abused by people of the higher caste. So yeah, so I think that's very relevant and interesting example. Now I want to touch about because you specialize in trauma related psychology and counseling. So are there, from your experience, is there a psychological profile of people for those who exploit and those who get exploited? So what makes someone more likely to fall into either of these categories basis your experience?
Well, if you look at the literature that deals specifically with personality and the way your personality is structured or shaped, you can definitely find some answers there. When we talk about perpetrators in general and people who exploit others, regardless of their bosses or if they're government officials or husbands or
Even
friends
in
or
that
whatever,
context.
they often what you see there is what we call dark triad. That's like the three personality characteristics that are dark, not good. One is narcissism, which I assume people understand, but generally it means like this high sense of entitlement. I'm the most important, I'm superior than others. The rules do not apply for me. I can do whatever I feel like if it meets my need. We mentioned Machiavelli, so we also have Machiavellism, which is basically manipulation, lack of moral concern, and saying, means justify the goal justifies the means in a sense. And psychopathy, which you also, I think, understand, which is characterized specifically by this lack of empathy that we talked about, a lack of guilt, manipulation, exploitation, all of these things. If we look at personalities of people who often go toward being exploited, they often have high trust and high agreeableness. They trust people, they say yes to more things than they should, and we have some research that demonstrate this, that people with high agreeableness are less likely to negotiate better salaries or to protest the bad treatment. Also, what we discussed, low power and some economic dependence, which goes often with these groups that we marginalize, like females or some marginalizing groups like, I don't know, Roma here or African Americans in the US. So, but from trauma point of view, again, I would go more toward nurture than nature. A lot of the perpetrators, a lot of the people who do bad have some experience of being on the other side, of especially being victims of violence and of different sorts of exploitation as children. So they reenact it, they take on the role of aggressor because they feel that the world is an unsafe place where they need to do it, or otherwise they will be victim. Sometimes in order to survive the mistreatment, especially if it happened to you as a child, you unconsciously use dissociation and numbing, which means that you can become insensitive to suffering of other people, or you can again justify it by saying, this happened to me, so whoever cared about me, and on the other hand, you can be desensitized to harming other people. You also, to go back to Bandura that I mentioned, we learn by modeling. So if you had a very violent father, or if you had a father who abused and exploited your mother, and he was rewarded for it, or at least not punished for it, this is something that you will get. And on the other hand, if we look at people who usually take on who are put in a role of a victim, better to say, they sometimes have this what we call learned helplessness, because they suffered for a long period of time and there were no help. There were no other people to help. This is very important. And you couldn't help yourself. You learn that things cannot be changed. You learn that there's nothing you can do. There's a very important experiment showed it that the dogs who were electrified stopped trying to get out. So the way to get, even without electricity, they didn't get out. Somebody had to come and pull them, which is very important for this issue too. Sometimes they also develop what we call a fawn or a fawn response, which means that, or Stockholm syndrome, somebody knows it on this name, where we, want to be good in this role. We think that if we please the abuser, if we appease him, that the harm will be less. So we try to behave like him. You try to give him what he wants, what he orders. And also because of the dissociation and numbing that I said, sometimes we really go numb. We don't feel the pain that's been inflicted to us. So I think that there's a lot of trauma, and probably that creates certain characteristics that we then later on can measure and see.
So putting oneself in the shoes of somebody who's getting exploited, What could be some strategies to break that cycle?
Well, I always remember Mandela, and he said education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. And I think that's it. First of all, we have to work on all of the levels. It's not just about helping an individual or helping one group. We have to change the system. We have to change what we teach people. We have to change values. We have to empower those who are suffering. We have to be those who are pulling them out and helping them. But I also think we need to help the perpetrators, because if we don't, then usually this continues. So they need some sort of help too. And to go back to what we're talking about, we need a different value system, the one of equality and justice and support and sharing. We need to reduce these gaps in financial and economical states. We need to protection of humans and workers' rights, especially in the vulnerable groups who are already being more likely to be a victim. We need to work on reducing poverty, misogynia, structural violence, which is violence portrayed by government and official bodies in a country. We need to also work on media and control the media, because a lot of the time it's the media who continues with this. And and we need to more of from a trauma perspective, I could say we need trauma-informed society and trauma-informed schools. We need to teach people some important things. One is to recognize the manipulative and exploitative dynamics, how it works, how it is used. We need to develop skills that help you protect yourself, that help you assert yourself, negotiate, set boundaries that are based on your self-worth, because a lot of the times you think that you deserve it and you're not worth it. We need to shift from learned helplessness to agency. And as I said, we also need to do some restorative justice. We need to focus on rehabilitation and helping those who did harm. And in terms of specific things that were linked to exploitation and making it smaller, perspective taking or empathy training turned to be very important. But as we remember, because the power sort of decreases this, which means putting yourself in other people's shoes. And there are good drama programs, there are good used in school where, let's say, a bully would be put in the shoes of those who he has bullied. But also we need to have a group of people around that is not going to applaud to the bullying, that is not going to think that this person is great and tough, that is not going to think that leaders who have power and abuse it are good, but are going to stand up and say, this is not okay, we don't want this, we want something else. Because what's prone to be the biggest problem maybe is, you ask about perpetrators and victims, but we have a huge number of people who are silent and who are not doing anything. And that's the problem. And I like what Rousseau once said. He said that where he discussed education, this was, ages ago, but he talks about modern society being too egoistic and corrupt and stuff. And he said that the primary goal of education should be the cultivation of the emotional sphere, developing love, compassion, and empathy. So he said it back then, and I think this is more important now than ever. And he said this is the path to make humans natural again, and for society to become more human, to become about being or not doing, only as Fromm would put it.
So my last question would be, from the technology aspect of it. So now with AI coming into picture, so there are two aspects to it. One, how individuals who want to exploit others, how would they leverage technology and, to exploit more, and how would that play out? And number two, if the AI becomes more superior than the humans, and, if humans start getting exploited by technology, how do you see that future?
To be honest, I don't know what would happen, because AI is still too far away from me. That's maybe for somebody from that background to say. I can only talk about what I've seen today, and I've seen the double effects. Of course, the negative effect is because there's this inhibition effect. Online and groups and all of this gives us anonymity, which of course reduces accountability. So we can do and say what we want, and that we definitely wouldn't do if we were face to face. It has also created forms of exploitation and abuse that we didn't have before, like cyberbullying, sexual exploitations online. People are being threatened by the pictures or videos that they had. People had stolen identities and stuff like this. So their technology enables a new form of exploitation. And on the other hand, what we also saw happening is something that Zuboff called surveillance capitalism, saying that now big tech companies exploit users by collecting data and they influence behavior, which I see even more troubling. So if you ask me about the future, this is something that I'm scared of, because I believe that lack of education is the reason for most troubles in our world, definitely exploitation on both sides. So if by using technology so that you will only get material that support your claim, that will connect you only with the people who have the exactly same opinion, which might be completely wrong, you will stay in this bubble where you feel that this is right. So if I find a group of people who are equally ready to exploit like I am, and I feel them this quasi information, that like, I don't know, you're less worthy of me, this is going to make it more. So I think this is something to think about, how to protect ourselves and how to increase exchange between people more. And I'm not sure if this is in the interest of capitalism, but it is a goal. On the other hand, we have to be fair and to say that it has also helped bring people together, and it has helped see some things and react to these things. We had international movements such as Me Too movement. We had whistleblowers. We had, investigative journalism that came from this. We had activists coming together. So I think also, to go back to the first question you asked me, it's again about user abuse of power or user abuse of technology and of the beauty that it brings.
Yeah. So for me, I had a lot of insights, very interesting examples, perspectives, and frameworks, research that you shared. So I think takeaway for me and for everybody would be three E's, which are important for this. One is education. More educated everybody is, the better they'll be able to stand up for themselves. Empathy, I think more training on being more empathetic towards to your the society and the network that you are with, and exchange. So I think what you exchange more from a positive side, which can in turn help to curb the exploitation which is happening out there. So thanks a
And if
lot,
I can
Tijana.
add two
Please.
things, sorry,
Yeah.
before we finish. Critical thinking, definitely one very important thing. So not to accept everything you hear or read or people tell you. Go to different sources, think about it, look the other way. And I think another, again, as I worked with a lot of people in war, and then they say everybody's doing this, to know it's never that everybody's doing this. Even in the worst of times, when everybody's, I don't know, when most people are killing each other, somebody's saving another human being. Somebody is not saying yes to this. So I think that we need to understand this too, that we have power and that it's up to us. So
yeah, I think you summed it up really well, saying we have the power and it is up to us on how do we stop this exploitation. So thanks a lot, Tijana, once again. Loved our conversation, and I'm sure the audience will love it too.
Thank you very much.